Hello, this is Ross Bliley from the podcast Pigskin Tales. This podcast is sponsored by Sterling Soap Company. With products sold throughout 41 locations around the globe, Sterling Soap Company has a unique assortment of products to choose from for your loved one for the holidays. Handmade artisan soaps created by Roderick and Amanda Lovin since 2012, these products are affordable and provide great value. Act now and save on your shipping costs. If you purchase $75 or more, your shipping cost is free in the United States. Shop now online at sterlingsoap.com.
What's up, sports history fan? Dana Augusta here of the Historically Speaking Sports Podcast. Ever wish you can get behind-the-scenes access to the Hockey Hall of Fame and dive into the untold stories that shaped the game? Then you need to check out Hockey Hall of Fame True Stories Part 2 by Eric Zweig. Eric's latest book is packed with wild, unexpected tales from epic rivalries and game-changing moments to quirky incidents like polo injuries and snowblower mishaps. Eric Zweig's impeccable research and passion for the sport of hockey will whisk you through the NHL's early years, the origins of the Three Stars tradition, and how hockey first hit the airwaves. Plus, you get fresh takes on legends like Wayne Gretzky, Bobby Hall, and Joe Sakic. Hockey Hall of Fame True Stories 2 is available now wherever you get your books. Grab your copy and get ready to dive deep into the heart of the game.
This podcast is part of the Sports History Network, your headquarters for the yesteryear of your favorite sport. You can learn more at sportshistorynetwork.com.
The NFL in Brooklyn? The Dodgers? Yep, you bet. That's right. From 1930 through 1944, the NFL placed a team in Brooklyn and called it the Dodgers. They also played at Ebbets Field, just like their Major League Baseball cousins. But unlike the baseball Dodgers, the football Dodgers did not catch on in the same way. And next, on Sports Forgotten Heroes, we'll take a look back at the history of the NFL's version of the Brooklyn Dodgers.
This is Sports Forgotten Heroes, a tribute to the stars who shaped the games we love to watch and the games we love to play. Stars who provided us with many thrills, but when their time was up, they faded away. We'll take a look back at their spectacular careers, their moments of fame, even if it was just for one season or just one game. And now, here's your host, Warren Rogan.
Hello and welcome to Sports Forgotten Heroes, episode number 144, the Brooklyn Football Dodgers. Yes, Brooklyn had an NFL team, and they were called the Dodgers. Now, the baseball version of the Dodgers were loved by the people who called Brooklyn home. The baseball Dodgers were a part of the borough's fabric. They had been there for decades, and everyone loved baseball. Professional football, on the other hand, especially back in the 1930s, was not nearly as popular as the game is today. In fact, professional football, or the NFL, was low in the pecking order. Baseball, college football, golf, boxing, horse racing, and even hockey were all considered to be much more popular than professional football. So the NFL, trying to break out of its reputation as a game that was played in small cities in front of small crowds, sought larger cities with the potential for larger crowds when smaller teams such as the Dayton Triangles fell into financial hardships. So in 1930, the Triangles relocated to Brooklyn and took on the popular name of the Dodgers in hopes of catching on with the locals. But unlike their baseball brethren, the football Dodgers, well, they never really caught on, and after the 1944 season, they packed up and they left for Boston. The Dodgers never won their division, never made the playoffs, and only 4 times finished at 500 or above. Joining me on today's episode of Sports Forgotten Heroes to talk about the Brooklyn Football Dodgers is Roger Godin. Several years ago, Roger dove in and wrote a terrific book called The Brooklyn Football Dodgers, The Other Bums. Now, while Roger has a ton of information to share with us, I'll also interject some commentary throughout. Also, please note, we did have a connection issue. Sorry about that, but nonetheless, we still have some great content for you. As always, please follow, rate, and review Sports Forgotten Heroes wherever you are listening, and please hit that subscribe button as well. Follow Sports Forgotten Heroes on X at SportsFHeroes, and you can follow on Facebook too. And as always, I thank you for your support. Okay, let's get into today's show with my guest, Roger Godin. Roger, thanks for joining me on Sports Forgotten Heroes. I am thrilled you are here.
Well, it's my pleasure to be here with you, Warren. The Dodger project is quite in my distant past, but I gave it a lot of effort and then put it aside and gave my attention to my everyday job, so to speak. So hopefully we can fill your listeners in with some insights into the Brooklyn football Dodgers.
Yeah. It's funny. We all have those day jobs that take us away from some of the things we really love, and it's just the way it is. But like I said, I'm thrilled you're here to talk about the Brooklyn football Dodgers. What piqued your interest in that team? Who were the Brooklyn football Dodgers?
Well, I tend to be interested in obscurity. Warren, I tell people I specialize in obscurity, and of course, the Brooklyn football Dodgers fit into that category. But I had some family connections to Brooklyn, which played into this as well. My late mother was born and raised in part in the borough. And that had a lot to do with it. And then the obscurity angle, of course, came in there. I've done another book about an obscure team, or relatively obscure, the St. Louis Browns baseball team, which, were like the Brooklyn football Dodgers, generally not successful. But in 1922 had probably their best overall year, although they did not win the American League pennant.
Mm-hmm. Did the football Dodgers have any relationship with the baseball Dodgers? Was there a co-ownership? I mean, how did this team come about?
Well, the origins of the team goes back to Dayton, Ohio, and then they wound up in Brooklyn. And actually, to answer you directly, there's no ongoing relationship between the baseball and football teams. The football Dodgers were owned ultimately by Dan Topping, who is better known for baseball, because later on he owned the New York Yankees.
Mm-hmm.
But I think a lot of people don't realize that he owned the football Dodgers, along with a friend of his by the name of John Shipwreck Kelly was a co-owner with him as well.
Did Topping and Kelly, did they need to get any sort of permission from the baseball Dodgers to use that name?
I have no evidence of that. That's a very good question, and usually the obvious questions are ones you overlook. But thinking back to the research I did, I don't recall that there was anything of that nature.
Just a general philosophical question here for you, Roger. Just your guess on this, perhaps. Familiarity, a word that I struggle with, familiarity. Baseball, back in the days of the Brooklyn Dodgers, they came in 1930 and were around until 1944, when they were known actually as the Brooklyn Tigers, I believe. But during that period, baseball was obviously the sport, and football was still experiencing some growing pains. But there were other teams that used baseball names. So you had the Brooklyn Dodgers, you had the New York Giants, one of the originals. But there were also the Pittsburgh Pirates at that time and the Cincinnati Reds at that time as well in the NFL. Do you think, just two guys having a chat here, do you think that part of the reason they used baseball names was to help the teams become more familiar with their fans?
Well, I think that's a reasonable conclusion to come to. And again, having said that, thinking back to the research I did, I don't recall that anywhere along the way that there was a specific reference to the fact that, we're going to call this football team the Dodgers because we want to capture the fact that the baseball team is far better known than in existence. But that's, of course, basically what happened. And in the 30s, they were largely unsuccessful. But in the late 30s, when they acquired Clarence Ace Parker, and then a couple of years after that, the coach became Doc Sutherland, who was actually Scottish-born and raised in part, but became a significant figure in American football. He had been coach at University of Pittsburgh and had great success there.
Mm-hmm.
But Pittsburgh got upset with him because he thought there was overemphasis on football. It's interesting what they would think now about overemphasis. What were they thinking back in the 30s? Well, anyway, he lost a job at Pittsburgh, which turned out to be a good thing for Brooklyn because he got the Dodger job and he was there for 2 years, 40 and 41. And those were the two most successful years, in 40, they challenged the Giants for the Eastern Division title and wound up with an 8-3-1 record. And Parker was the most valuable player in the NFL that year.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But then the following year, they did almost as well in 41, although they had a 3-game losing streak that kind of did them in the roughly mid-season, which played into their not being able to better challenge the Giants for the title. But they did wind up playing them on, as it turned out to be, Pearl Harbor Day.
Mm.
They played the Giants in the Polo Grounds and pulled off a victory over them. And it's kind of interesting in that the various players that I talked to had different impressions as to what was going on out in Hawaii. Some seem to be aware that there were announcements about various officers being asked to report to their respective headquarters, and then there were others who had no particular memory of anything. So, but there obviously was some reference there, and but it was a great victory for Brooklyn, even though obviously they didn't win the Eastern Division. But they beat the Giants twice, which is something they had never done before.
Going back even further, they were originally, I think they were called the Dayton Triangles, and then
I think.
Yeah,
you're correct.
Yeah, and then they moved to Brooklyn. Why leave Dayton and why go to Brooklyn? What was the reason? Maybe they just needed to leave Dayton. I get it, not a major metropolitan area, but why did they choose Brooklyn? So on July 12th, 1930, the Dayton Triangles were officially sold to a New York syndicate led by John Dwyer. The Triangles, they just never caught on in the way many had hoped. Dayton, like some of the other small market teams in the NFL, just couldn't compete financially. Consider, They played in the 5,000-seat Triangle Park, and they couldn't fill it. They had to rely on local players because they were losing out on better players to wealthier teams. And with the team's performance on the field suffering, attendance suffered too. And Dayton was just too small to support a team in the way that an NFL team really needed support. So, despite the fact that the Triangles were an NFL original, which makes the Dodgers an NFL original, and the fact that the Triangles hosted the first ever NFL game, a 14-0 win over the Columbus Panhandles, the team packed up and moved to Brooklyn. Now, here's something very interesting. There are traces of the Dayton Triangles today. Yes, the Triangles live on. From 1920 through the 1929 season, they were the Dayton Triangles, and then they moved to Brooklyn. 1930 through 1944, the Triangles became the Brooklyn Dodgers. In 1944, they renamed themselves the Tigers. 1945, they merged with the Brooklyn Yanks, and in 1949, the Yanks moved to New York and became the New York Bulldogs. Are you following? In 1950, when the AAFC merged with the NFL, the Bulldog players were sold off to the New York Giants. And in 1952, the Yanks were sold back to the NFL, and they moved to Dallas to become the Dallas Texans. After a very rough ride in Dallas, the team was again sold back to the NFL, and in 1953, they became the Baltimore Colts. And of course, in 1984, they left Baltimore, and now they are the Indianapolis Colts. So, in a way, the Dayton Triangles and the Brooklyn Dodgers, they still exist today. Throughout the early years of the NFL, the league struggled to gain traction, particularly on a national level. It was really a league that focused heavily on the Midwest and the Northeast. Many of the teams were located in small towns or cities, places such as Portsmouth, Staten Island, Frankfurt, and Providence. These were locations where the NFL was trying to gain a foothold, but it wasn't working. The league needed bigger cities and larger crowds to survive. So Dayton, again, played in a small city, in a small stadium, and for the Triangles to survive, they needed something bigger. Brooklyn was a lot bigger, and much larger crowds were needed in order for the team to survive.
I think that the NFL was interested in having a further presence in New York beyond the Giants, and of course, Brooklyn would be logically a place for it. So it worked out that way. But I can't really pull back whether there was anything really planned that way. But anyway, it worked out well for Brooklyn in the terms of when Jock Sutherland came around and gave them 2 really great years.
Mm-hmm. You know, when you think about all the stories we hear about the Brooklyn Dodgers in baseball, it was like they had some sort of love affair, or the borough of Brooklyn had a love affair with the baseball Brooklyn Dodgers. What was the relationship like with the NFL team? What was the borough's relationship like with the football team?
Well, it wasn't quite what who was with the baseball team, and of course there's obvious reasons for that, because as you alluded to earlier, pro football in those days was not a significant activity. The 2 big sporting activities were baseball and college football,
Mm-hmm.
But they came along and became, as I say, competitive in the late 30s. And I should allude to the fact that it wasn't just Parker, although he was the overwhelmingly noteworthy player. That he could do everything: punt, kick, pass. He could do all of that very well, and brought them a degree of recognition that they hadn't had in the time frame of the 1930s period. Although during that period there was a noteworthy guy by the name of Ralph Kercheval, who was a college player from Kentucky, who was quite a good place kicker. But the real big names do not arrive until the late 30s. And actually, they were somewhat in place when Sutherland came along, but it took Sutherland to mold them together and make the team competitive.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, they did have a couple of well-known names during the course of their existence play for the Brooklyn Dodgers. You had Ace Parker, who you just mentioned, and I've done a podcast on Ace, and the guy was just a superstar. Also tried his hand at Major League Baseball. You had Bruiser Kennard. You had Benny Friedman, who was a terrific football player as well. Who else? I mean, were there any other real notable players to wear the Dodgers uniform, and maybe what made them stand out during their time with the team?
Yeah, that's a good point. There are a couple others that I'll mention, and it's interesting that you would bring up Benny Friedman, who would have been there in the early 30s, and they had a degree of competitiveness then, and I think Friedman can be given credit for that. But later on, besides the ones you mentioned, Perry Schwartz was a great end. We don't have ends anymore, right? We have wide receivers and tight ends, I guess. Schwartz was from the University of California and quite a significant player for Brooklyn in that era. And Pug Manders was a great, was a fullback and actually led the NFL in rushing yards in 1941. He was his brother Jack played for the Bears, but he and was probably perhaps somewhat better known. But Pug played at Drake and then went on to the Dodgers and was a significant factor in their success. Kennard, you mentioned, by the way, I think it's interesting to noteworthy. Two of the Dodgers wound up in the Hall of Fame in Canton. Parker and Kennard is the other one. Kennard was a great tackle who was not physically overwhelming, but he was noted to be able to throw his body around effectively and was quite noteworthy for that. He ultimately wound up back at the University of Mississippi, which was his alma mater, and he became athletic director there ultimately. But those two Dodgers are the most noteworthy members of the Hall of Fame. Now, there are a couple of others that the names escape me who had played for other teams, but also played for Brooklyn that wound up in the Hall. But I can't pull those names back right offhand.
Sure. The Dayton Triangles played their big years were obviously during the Great Depression, and the NFL struggled during that time. And I just wonder if part of the reason why Dayton left and moved to Brooklyn was because of how populous the New York City area was, because there were other teams there in New York. I mean, we think today about New York having the Giants and the Jets, but man, during, in the beginning years of the Dodgers, you also had the Giants, but you had a team called the Staten Island Stapletons, and down the road you had the Newark Tornadoes for a year or two as well. The history of the NFL in New York before the Dodgers, well, it runs deep. In 1921, the APFA, or the American Professional Football Association, consisted of 21 teams. Now, the APFA was the predecessor to the NFL. They had a team in New York. They were called the New York Brickley Giants. They only lasted 2 games. 1925 is when another team tried to make it in New York, the Giants, and of course, they're still around today. In fact, this season, they are celebrating their 100th anniversary. There was also another team in Brooklyn, and they were called the Lions, and they played for just 2 years. In 1927, another New York team joined the league, the Yankees, and they made it just 2 years. In 1929, along came the Staten Island Stapletons, and they made it a few years through 1932. In 1929, the NFL also had a team in New Jersey, the Orange Tornadoes, and then they rebranded themselves the Newark Tornadoes in 1930 before folding up shop. Those early years of the NFL, there were a lot of one-offs, teams moving around without a lot of structure. It wasn't until 1933 that the NFL started to resemble the league it is today when it split into an Eastern Division and a Western Division. So we just talked about some of the more notable players to wear the Brooklyn Dodgers uniform, but there were a couple of notable coaches that patrolled the sidelines for the Dodgers as well. You had Potsy Clark, Benny Friedman, who we said was one of the players, also spent a year as a coach of the Dodgers, and of course, Jock Sutherland. What can you tell us more about Jock?
Well, Sutherland wasn't exactly a warm, fuzzy guy. The term dour has been used, D-O-U-R. He ruled, I would say, with an iron hand, but he ruled successfully with an iron hand. By the way, he was also a dentist by trade, which I think a lot of people may not realize, if they even remember him at all or even know about him at all. But he was actually a doctor, a dentist doctor. Okay. And I believe he practiced dentistry during the off season. This wasn't in an era where he made enough money where you could, get by without some other way of earning income. So, but anyway, he was definitely hard nosed. But if you were on his good side, well, that was fine. But if you weren't, then that could cause you some difficulty. But there's no question he had the ability to mold winning teams. Mm-hmm. Now, when the war came by, with he and Parker were most noteworthy in their exit, of course. Both actually wound up in the Navy. Sutherland was got a naval commission of an administrative nature, which kept him in the United States. And Parker also had a naval commission, and I think he also. Well, I think he did shipboard service. I think he stayed basically in the U.S. Either went overseas. But anyway, the point of that is that with the two biggies gone, then things went, might say, back to the way they were. So that the 42 team, you went from 7-4 in 41 to 3-8 in 43. In 42.
Right.
Well,
42.
I'm thinking.
42, yeah.
Yeah, 42, yeah. As far as other, you mentioned some coaches there, but those are largely.
Well, Potsy Clark was there for 3 years.
Yeah, that's true.
I think he might have coached the Dodgers. Let me see here. Yeah, he coached the Dodgers longer than anyone, 3 years. So they had a lot of turnover in their 15 years playing football in Brooklyn. When you consider that Potsy Clark lasted longer than anyone at 3 years.
Yeah, that's a good point.
What kind of style, style of play usually changes with each coach, but was there any particular style of play that the Dodgers were known for? Was it, single wing, I formation? Did they have any style of play that they were best known for during their period of time in Brooklyn?
Yeah, it would have been when Sutherland was there because he was an advocate of the single wing,
Mm-hmm.
Which he had used at Pittsburgh. So that was his forte. Now, if you threw that name out today, I think most people would know what you were talking about.
Yeah. Actually, doing some research for another podcast right now, and the single wing is a big part of it. It's Fritz Chrysler up at the University of Michigan when he was there, and it was something that the great George Allen first adopted from Fritz Chrysler, and he thought that was a great way to attack on offense. Looking at the Dodgers, what did they look like? What were the colors of their uniforms? When you saw the Dodgers on the field, what was their identity? What did they look like?
It was overwhelmingly red. Okay, and then, however, when after World War II, when they were no longer in the NFL, and of course the Brooklyn team wound up in the All-America Conference for 3 years. 46, 47, 48. They retained the red, but in 48 they adopted the Dodger baseball blue. Okay, for that last year. But if you were to throw a significant color out there, it would be red.
October 22nd, 1939, the first attempt at televising an NFL game occurred. The Philadelphia Eagles versus the Brooklyn Dodgers. A few weeks earlier, NBC had attempted to televise its first ever college football game between Fordham and Waynesboro. Ebbets Field was chosen because of its proximity to the Empire State Building, and the transmitter that sat atop it, well, it could pick up the signal from a 50-mile radius. A crew of 8 was on hand, including a mobile truck. Cameras were placed near the 40-yard line box seats and one in the upper deck. The commentator for the game was Alan "Skip" Waltz. The game was broadcast in New York, where an estimate of 1,000 people watched it. The Dodgers won the game 23-14 to up their record to 3-3-1, while the Eagles fell to 0-4-1. Incidentally, the one tie, well, that was a 0-0 tie between the two teams a few weeks earlier. Let's talk about some of the other things here about the Brooklyn Dodgers. They started play, like we said, in Brooklyn in 1930 after having moved there from Dayton, and they played through the 1943 season as the Dodgers. In 1944, they were the Brooklyn Tigers, if I follow that correctly. What, in your estimation, during their time in Brooklyn, what were their primary challenges during their existence, both on and off the field?
Well, I guess the primary challenge is something that would exist for just about any team, which is to be successful on the field, And they had not been successful on the field, largely speaking, in the 30s, with some exceptions. You allude to Patsy Clark and Benny Friedman, but they were not viewed as really a contender until the late 30s and early 40s when Jock Sutherland comes along. So you alluded to the fans and that kind of thing. There was an informal group, and you'll read that when you see the book, called The Jerks. quite literally the Jerks, they called themselves, and they sort of had an informal band and played together. Oh, and by the way, in reference to music, I think this is worth noting. In the second successful year of Sutherland's reign there, October of 41, they played the Chicago Cardinals, and Topping decided it would be a good idea to have the best big band of the era there to play. So Glenn Miller and his orchestra actually played at halftime.
Oh, wow.
In October of 41. Yeah, they actually lost that game, and it's a game that they should have won because Chicago was pretty weak, but it's part of that 3-game losing streak I alluded to. But you couldn't have had a bigger name than Miller as far as big bands go. Because he had just finished a movie, I think, called Orchestra Wives, fairly close to the time of the game. I'm a Miller fan, by the way.
You mentioned it earlier about Pearl Harbor, and in all sports, obviously, the war had a great effect on all the sports, all the teams. But can you go any deeper at all on how the war affected the Brooklyn Dodgers, particularly in terms of player availability and team operations? Were the Dodgers at all faced with any adversity during that time? The Dodgers didn't lose too many players to the war, but they certainly lost key ingredients such as their number one star, Ace Parker, who left after the 1941 season and didn't return until 1945. The team's coach, Jock Sutherland, he left for the war too, as did a few others such as left end Perry Schwartz and halfback Merle Condon.
Certainly they lost some significant players. Mm-hmm. But the one that they held on to was Bruiser Kennard. But of course, he was a tackle, so he wasn't going to be scoring any touchdowns.
What financial difficulties did the Dodgers encounter while playing in Brooklyn, and how much did that contribute to the team's eventual decline?
I don't really know about the financial difficulties. They obviously managed to stay in place, and I think Topping had the resources of his own to keep them in place. But I can't recall right offhand.
Well, let me ask you this, because it's so interesting to me. Like you said, I mean, Topping had the financial resources. So 2 questions here for you. They were the Dodgers. I don't know if you remember why, but why did they change their name from the Dodgers to the Tigers? And why did they leave Brooklyn? What was the ultimate reason for leaving Brooklyn?
Well, as I recall, the adoption of the Tiger name was to give the team a different approach, so to speak, because they obviously had declined in 42 and 43. They won 2 games, I think, in 43. Mm-hmm. And so it was a decision made by the then management, which was, as I recall, a guy named Dennis Shea was the general manager at the time, to go with a different name. And of course, that didn't work very well, as they were playing 10 games in 1944, and they wound up going 0-10.
Yeah.
Although I do believe they won an exhibition game or 2, but of course, obviously that doesn't count. So, I don't know, what was the rest of the question?
Why did they ultimately leave Brooklyn?
Oh, ultimately, yeah, actually, Topping really wanted to get another situation in the NFL, and so he was able to work out a merger with the Boston team in the NFL, and so basically the Tigers and Boston merged and became the Boston Yanks in 1945. And I don't. I'm trying to recall right hand. I don't think they had any particular success. And then, of course, that was the end of it because the new league came along with the All-America Conference in 46, and Topping wound up with ironically, wound up with the New York Yankee franchise in the All-America Conference.
Yeah, we allude to that. I talk about that team quite often. The New York Yankees of the All-America Football Conference. Yes, there was a New York Yankees football team. Hey, when the Dodgers left Brooklyn, this is the football Dodgers, what was the fan response? Did they even care? Was there any sadness? You know, I'm sure it wasn't like when the baseball Dodgers left.
No, I have no evidence that there was any great gnashing of teeth upon their departure, but, because of this whole merger with Boston and then with the new league coming in and Topping getting the New York team, he wound up with some former Dodgers playing for the Yankees in the All-America Conference in 46. And so Parker plays for the Yankees in 46, which is the last year he played, I believe. And there might have been some others that just escaped me at the moment.
Well, you've mentioned it a couple of times, the All-America Football Conference, and we know that the Cleveland Browns ruled that league like nobody's business. But the Dodgers, there was a Brooklyn Dodgers team in the All-America Football Conference. The second attempt at this franchise. And that was 46 and 47 and 48. How did the Dodgers come about, and why, if did the AAFC try to put another team in Brooklyn and call them the Dodgers? How did that team fare? What was that all about? The AAFC, the All-America Football Conference, sought to do something the NFL hadn't: pay players larger salaries, put teams in the biggest cities, and expand professional football across the country. Again, the NFL was largely a Midwest and Northeast league, but they did expand in 1945 to California with the Los Angeles Rams. The AAFC spread to the south with a team in Miami, Florida, and out west with two teams, one in Los Angeles and one in San Francisco. But New York was important too, and Arch Ward brought football back to New York with a team in Buffalo, two teams in the New York City area, the Bronx with the Yankees, and Brooklyn with another version of the Dodgers.
I wanted to touch on one player that the Dodgers had in the All-America Conference.
Sure.
That was Glenn Dobbs. Yeah, he was a particularly noteworthy player. Even though they weren't very successful, he was one of these somewhat like Parker, in that he could do everything. And I think he was also named the most valuable player in the All-America Conference in 1946. But then in early 47, the Dodgers traded him to the Los Angeles Dons, and he finished out his career there and in the CFL as well. But back in the day, Glenn Dobbs was a significant figure.
Yeah, I mean, he rushed for over 18. He was a tailback, but he had 1,886 yards, threw for 13 touchdowns, had 15 interceptions, and like you say, he was the MVP that first year with Brooklyn in the AAFC. He was a heck of a ball player.
Yeah, he certainly was. Went to Tulsa, I believe, was his college. Anyway, he ultimately wound up being an athletic director at some college that escapes me at the moment.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just...
Roger, let me ask you this. What, in your estimation, let me ask you this. In your estimation, what is the legacy of the Brooklyn Dodgers football team? What's their legacy?
Well, I guess the only thing I could cite as legacy was that it gave Jock Sutherland an opportunity to be a coach in the NFL. And he proved that while he was a successful coach at the University of Pittsburgh, he could also do it in the pros. So, if there's a legacy, it's with him, and also having one of the longtime best players in the NFL in Ace Barker. Barker also went on to be although he was a far better football player than a baseball player, but he wound up being a significant.
He was a great coach in baseball.
Baseball coach at Duke.
Yep.
And had a nice career, although he subsequently also scouted for a couple of NFL teams.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Well, Roger, I want to thank you for taking some time to spend with us. I know this is getting towards your busy season with the Minnesota Wild in the NHL, and you wrote this book a long time ago about the Brooklyn football Dodgers, and the information that you've shared with us is certainly appreciated. I thank you so much for joining me on Sports Forgotten Heroes.
Well, I appreciate your interviewing me, and I hope that I was able to provide some information that was useful.
Absolutely.
I realized that there were some things that would seem rather obvious that I couldn't pull back, so you'll have to forgive me for that. And I guess I'll go back and take a look.
No,
the answers to those questions.
No worries. It's all good. Sometimes you have to wonder how things would have turned out had some teams done better on the field. Would there still be a Brooklyn Dodgers football team had they won a few more games, contended for a championship here and there? Obviously, New York plays host to at least two teams in every major sport. Maybe, just maybe, had the Dodgers done better, New York would actually have three teams: the incumbent New York Giants and the New York Jets, who came over from the AFL. Hey, thanks again to Roger for spending time with us, and thanks to all of you for listening, and I'll see you next time on Sports Forgotten Heroes.
Hey there, sports history fan. This is Arnie Chapman, a.k.a. the Football History Dude, and I hope that you enjoyed this recent episode presented by the Sports History Network and were able to learn some good old-fashioned sports history knowledge nuggets. I started the Sports History Network back in 2020 with the mission to help podcasters find a community of like-minded sports history nerds, as well as helping aspiring podcasters to start their own shows. We have a little bit over 30 shows on the network right now covering all sorts of sports history, but as far as I'm concerned, we're just at the toothpick in the ocean moment, that can't even figure it out because there's so much more coming. We wanted to create the ultimate headquarters for sports yesteryear, starting with Podcast Network and our website, but we're going to continue to move into other mediums as well. And here's the cool part, because we want you to be part of our team. So if you're interested in starting your own podcast, or maybe being a guest on one of our shows, or who knows, maybe even writing an article for us over on the website. Seriously, all you got to do is reach out to us on the contact page over at sportshistorynetwork.com. You can be as technologically savvy as a Neanderthal tapping on a stone trying to figure out this whole hieroglyphics thing back in the day. Again, it doesn't matter, because even if you don't understand the whole podcast space, we have a production team that can pretty much help you out with doing everything. All you got to do, head over to sportshistorynetwork.com, head to the contact page, fill it out. That message goes right to me, and I'll reach out to you as soon as I can. But for now, dude, I'm through if you're through.